Hi peeps, time for your religion lesson. Yesterday we began talking about Abraham, and remember I said there's three parts to Abraham's story. I first want to start off by rereading the fourth paragraph in chapter 7 of our textbook. So you can just listen. If you want to follow along in your book, you can open up to page 32. And I'll read for you just to recap. Later, there was another man who loved and served God. His name was Abraham. He had faith in God, a gift that makes us able to believe all that God tells us. Abraham was always obedient to God, even when it was difficult. God promised to make of Abraham a great nation. From these people the Savior would be born. Some of Abraham's descendants are still among us today. They are the people we now call the Jewish people. So, yesterday we talked a little bit about this faith that Abraham had. So, faith, believing in something even when you can't see it, but believing it anyway, that gift of faith and your gift of obedience, where you're able to follow the rules, follow commands. So faith and obedience are big points in this chapter. Remember, Noah was known for his obedience. Page 31, when we talked about Noah, he always did what he was told by God. And so Noah and Abraham, both very obedient, both very faithful. And we're given those gifts of faith and obedience at baptism. But just because you have those gifts doesn't mean that faith and obedience are easy. Just like if you were to get a gift for Christmas, let's say you got a brand new ball. And maybe in the beginning you played with it, you took really good care of it, you always cleaned it off, and you kept it in a safe place so you always knew where it was. Maybe after a couple months, you get a new toy, and you forget about that ball. Maybe you played with it one time, then you didn't put it away because you had this new toy to play with. If you don't take care of your gift, what's going to happen to it? Maybe it got left out in the rain. Maybe it got kicked under the deck, and you didn't put it away, and then it got forgotten about. If you don't take care of your gifts, do they stay nice and fresh and new? No, just like the gift of faith and the gift of obedience, these are your gifts, and you have to practice them and always be thinking about them. Am I being faithful to God? Am I believing everything, all of God's teachings and following through with them? Am I listening to God's commands? And sometimes God's commands come through your parents, those older than you, like your teachers, people who are trying to teach you how to do good things and stay virtuous. So the only way to take care of these gifts is to keep practicing them and keep thinking about them. And Abraham and Noah were amazing at this. So we have those gifts, and we have to keep those gifts fresh in us. But let's talk about Abraham. So yesterday in this book, we talked about how Abraham was asked to move to a new land, a completely new place that he'd never been, Canaan. And so he did it. He obeyed God's command. Even though he didn't understand it, he followed through with it anyway. And once Abraham got there, take a look at this picture. So one night, God spoke again to Abraham. "Look up at the stars and count if you can. Your people will be as many as the stars in the sky." Abraham looked sad. "But I have no sons, and Sarah and I are too old to have children." "You must have faith in me," God replied. So, God told Abraham, you're going to have many descendants. Remember, I talked about how descendants means your children and your children's children and your children's children have children and all the people after you. So like your descendants of your parents and your grandparents and your grandparents' parents, so your great-grandparents. So that's kind of like the chain of descendants. So Abraham and Sarah were very old at this point. They were like grandparent age. And they didn't have any children. But God told them they were going to have many descendants. Now, if they don't have any children, they don't have children to have children's children, how can they have descendants if they don't have any children? No one to pass on down the line. And they're too old. You don't really picture your grandparents having children, do you? So when you're that old, nowadays, people can't have children when they're your grandparents' age, right? Way too old. So Abraham was a little sad, and he was like, we're not going to be able to have children. But God said, have faith. And what do you think happened? Do you think they were able to have children? Yeah, they were. Because God said it would happen, it happened. They had a son. And their son's name is Isaac. And that's who you drew a picture of yesterday. Their son, named Isaac, they were faithful to God. They didn't understand it. They're like, how could we have children? We're too old. But just because they didn't understand it didn't mean they didn't believe it would happen. They trusted it would happen, and it did. So Abraham and Sarah both had a lot of faith in God, and it's pretty powerful. So in your activity book, remember Abraham and Noah, what's extra special about them is that they were among the people who had to wait a very long time for the Savior to come. Remember, God promised He would send the Savior, Jesus Christ. But people didn't know how long they had to wait. And so Noah, at Noah's point, he was the only one who was able to remain faithful and obedient to God. So God washed away everyone in the world and just left Noah and his family and all those animals to restart the world. And Abraham came along after Noah. And Abraham was one of those people who remained faithful while waiting for the Savior. They had to wait a long, long time. So think about what would happen if we were in the classroom and I said, boys and girls, I'll be right back. I have to go upstairs to the 8th grade room to talk to them about books. I need you to stay well behaved while I'm gone. And I just left. And I left you without anyone to keep an eye on you. I didn't tell you how long I would be gone. I just said I have to go talk to the 8th grade. Would you be able to stay well behaved while I was gone? You didn't know when I was coming back. Would you be tempted to do naughty things, to talk to each other? Or would you sit quietly and continue doing your work? Well, that would only be a very short amount of time. Imagine how long these people had to stay really well behaved and obedient and faithful. This is a very long time. So page 27 in your activity book is about waiting. And what would you do if you had to wait a long time? So you're going to think about these questions and give me some responses. If you had to wait a long time, what would you do? Would you be angry or impatient? So would you get mad if you had to wait a long time? Would you learn about God? So imagine you were one of the people having to wait for God to come, for the Savior to come. If you had to wait that long, would you start getting angry? Like, when is God going to send our Savior? I'm mad. Would you take that time to learn about God? Would you forget while you were waiting? Would you live your life and then forget that there was even a Savior that was coming? Would you spend that time reading the Bible? So you're going to read through these and think about what you would do if you had to wait a very long time for Jesus, for the Savior. And maybe it's waiting a long time for anything. Really, what would you do if you had to wait a long time for something? So I want you to think about that, and tomorrow we're going to talk about our last part of Abraham, where he is put in the terrible, awful position of having to sacrifice his own son. So stay tuned.